recording. I cannot.
Okay, well, we'll give it a few minutes here. I guess a few things. Jim, you got to drop at quarter after?
Correct. Yeah.
Sir. Okay. And did you have anything you wanted to share before we get going, Jim? And by the way, the batting order is we're going to talk a little about Chip, Beau, and whoever wants to chime in, the Storm 0558 compromise a little bit, and then Microsoft's recent reaction to that in terms of free logging for everybody, which is a big to do. And it'd be interesting to see what you guys can capture out of that, Jim, in the SaaS Alerts platform, and maybe what correlations could be coming down the pike from you guys as well. That'd be really interesting to see. But so that's what we're going to talk about first, and then we'll get into a scenario 2 with Beau from Backdoors Breaches, and then we take a week off, right, Beau, and then have you back.
I think we're doing next week. I think
we're next week. Yeah.
Okay, we're back week.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the other big news, Jim, is, and everybody, is Chip is going to come on Cybercall Monday and really going deep into this compromise. Is Chip with us, by the way?
He is. I see him.
Oh, there he is. Okay. I see him. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, and Chip, you feel this is one of the most sophisticated attacks you've seen, correct? When you started, because you've dug into this pretty substantially.
Chip, you're on mute.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, Andrew, it's definitely there's still some really big unanswered questions, right? So the level of sophistication is absolutely there. It's amazing. I really dug into this and walked through the scenarios. It's amazing how trivially easy it is to pull this hack off if you can do the one big thing that Microsoft still doesn't know how they did, right? Which is steal the private key that's used to create access tokens. And when you really dig into Microsoft's whole auth procedure, which follows like standard OAuth 2 guidelines, it's not like they did anything wrong. You realize how incredibly important it is to maintain key stores and make sure that this kind of thing can't happen. Mm-hmm. The other piece of this that Microsoft disclosed in the second article that they put out is they acknowledged that this was a vulnerability built into their code and the implementation of how OAuth worked and how the key stores were set up to work between the two different sides of the Microsoft house, the consumer side and the enterprise side. This consumer key never should have been able to create an access token that was capable of granting access to enterprise side resources, Azure AD. And they acknowledged that. So that was, I think, an important acknowledgement on their part. They learned about it. They fixed it quickly. They remediated it. It's definitely possible that there could be other customers out there who were impacted by this that, they still don't know about it. Microsoft claims that they notified everybody. I don't know how many of you guys follow the Reddit security threads, or MSP threads, but people are going, yeah, right. Like, we're actually going to believe Microsoft when they say they notified everybody, and yet they've kind of held us in the dark. I think some of that is what's led to the change in logging policy. Basically, everyone's going to be bumped up to the equivalent of a P1 or a premium license from a logging perspective. So all those businesses out there with Microsoft 365 standard or Office 365 standard, they're going to get bumped up. They're saying September. So apparently there's some lead time for them to do that. Yeah, it definitely gives some advantages in terms of what's available from a logging perspective. We always tell our partners that it's not a requirement that their customers have a P1 license, but we suggest that they can get better logging information and access to tools that provide better security for their customers. So I think that's a good step on Microsoft's part. I don't remember which senator it was, but in the wake of this, one of the politicians made a classic comment. He goes, "This would be like Volvo selling you a car without a steering wheel and seatbelts." referring to Microsoft's previous policy on not giving people advanced security logging and monitoring. So there's still more to unfold. I don't know if we're ever going to find out how this token got stolen. You know, I don't even see people speculating about that. I wonder, you know, Beau, I'd love your opinion on this following conjecture. I really wonder if it's an inside job that this thing worked its way out. You know, this was supposedly an unused, but not, it was a no longer used private key, but it hadn't been disabled. So, you know, how does that happen? Like it just has if you equate it to the physical world, it's like, you know, like somebody snuck out one of your house keys, one of your guests that was there, or an employee who was working, and later came back in and robbed you while you were on vacation. So you know, you just wonder if it's sort of an inside job, or if there's a deeper flaw that, you know, that they haven't even ferreted out yet. So I think there are more shoes to drop.
Chip, over to Beau, like Beau, you know, when you, because obviously, you know, you play this offensive role, like, would you have ever thought, maybe I'll look at consumer side to get into, you know, you know, an Azure Federal, like,
Yeah,
would that cross your mind ever, or does Chip onto something here?
Yeah, so it's super interesting, right? Like it's an absolutely, I would say, unique attack path. And so one thing that, you know, I've kind of thought about heavily after hearing about this incident is, if you so it's possible to have both a consumer account and an enterprise account with the exact same email address, right? So you can go to the Microsoft online portal and have like an outlook.com address that is actually tied to your corporate email address, right? And you can, when you go to authenticate, it asks you, it says, do you want to sign into your personal account, or do you want to sign into your work account, right? And so, you know, theoretically, right, like that one single portal is the place that all of that authentication is happening. So the same authentication system is being utilized for both the consumer side and the enterprise side. So there's, you know, the more you think about that one specific thing, it brings up this whole topic of like, okay, well, what if I just, you know, magically requested a token, but I specified this API over here using the same authentication schema, but using my consumer account, right? And that's kind of like some of the ideas that kind of come out of this for me is like, how many other places can I go with my consumer account and then, you know, authenticate, you know, have a valid token as a consumer, but then leverage that on the enterprise side. You know, so, you know, your consumer account, right? You know, in the grand scheme of like passwords, password reuse is always a really big problem, right? I think we talked about it last week some. And, you know, theoretically, right, you know, attackers find a credential for a personal account and then somehow figure out a vulnerability like this where you can leverage that authenticated token, but then leverage it in other ways on the enterprise side. That's kind of like where I would totally pursue like R&D based off of this particular incident.
Got it.
Yeah. And Beau brings up another interesting point that was revealed. Again, I don't know how deeply folks on this call have read about the anatomy of this attack and its consequences, but this Storm 0558 group specifically went after individual accounts of some of the government targets. So they knew that people had both sides of this, right? Exactly what Beau describes, you know. And by the way, think about it, guys. Same thing with Gmail. You've got customers out there that have a personal Gmail account and they have a Google Workspace account.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Gmail also uses OAuth flow and JWT, like they use all the same technologies for providing access to end users. So, you know, I'm guessing that somebody, you know, at Google when this occurred was like all over that going, wait a minute, we better take a good look at ourselves and make sure that this can't happen here.
Right.
So
yeah, and if you look at a JWT, right, if you look at a JSON web token and the content of it, usually the identity is tied to the email address, right? And so like once you have a valid authenticated token, you know, depending on how you are actually validating that on the backside, it's like, oh yeah, you are who you say you are. I'm going to let you into this protected area because your JWT says that you are that email address, right? Even though you signed it on a personal side, you know, there potentially is that risk there for it being misused on the enterprise side.
Yeah. Next week on the cyber call, I can take, I'll take people through a couple of slides that actually show what this looks like with the JWT and how it's used to create the authorization token and request the access token that comes back with the signed key. It's not hard to figure out, and you realize that, my God, these keys hold so much power. And we all deal with secrets and keys, key stores in our businesses, or many of us do. So, it just re-emphasizes how important that is with your customers, when you're giving them consulting advice about how their cloud environments are configured. I don't know, I'm sure some of our MSPs have customers out there that have applications that they've built, maybe mobile applications. They've got some function on their website. Like this key store topic is one that I don't think we focus on really in this community all that much. So that's the update, Andrew, if we still have you.
Sorry about that. I had a quick interruption. My bad.
Yeah,
But
the ducks.
yeah, no, the ducks wanted to come in. Jim, when you hear all this, the visionary of SaaS alerts, any things come to mind? Like, hey, you obviously have a great technologist here with Chip, but is it like, hey, we should figure out, is there ways in which we're going to take the product, knowing now that Microsoft is, giving us some more telemetry, for lack of a better word?
So first of all, just to set it straight, like Chip is the product visionary. I'm just the go-to-market visionary.
Oh no, I thought you were the technologist. I had it.
Okay. In case people hadn't figured that one out yet. But one of the things that we feel really strongly about is, the automation that we're bringing to the table. And there's now news, and it's a good thing that Microsoft is going to be now sharing the logs for up to 180 days now with premium. That's all great news for a lot of people. That should have been done a long time ago. But it still requires the diligence, right, to be monitoring those logs and those events, and to be making sure that there's real-time monitoring of them, and then action associated with it. And from a go-to-market perspective, that's the messaging that we really focus on is, look, we're going to see it. We're going to see it in real time. You're going to be able to set up rules to block any nefarious behavior based on, what you think is important. And obviously we have default categories, but, from a just automation perspective, that's where we think the future really is, and where our focus is. And that leads right into Fortify, and what we're releasing next month in August. And again, for those that haven't signed up for the SASE call for the August 3rd, where we're releasing that to our partners, highly recommend you be there for that, because that's where we're unveiling additional automation that's going to make you guys more secure.
Chip, how about you, real quick, from a vision, product vision perspective? Does it get your wheels turning that we could do more with, with our partners now that these logs are going to be available?
It definitely gets my wheels turning. Specific to this issue, Microsoft has released as part of their, to the security community, in their blogs, that they've released some specific signatures or IOCs around this particular attack. So SaaS alerts will certainly develop another event that we're going to track as an independent IOC. I don't think it can be used by itself, because there are other conditions under which those things can occur. So it still needs to be combined with other specific as event to build, what I call an IOC package, really, right? These 3 or 4 things happen in sequence, and now you've got a strong indication with a high probability of a compromised account. So that's going to be helpful, and our team is already working on that. One of the challenges there, I'll tell you guys now, because I know it's a hot button for every single one of our partners, is these events, this mail item access, which is the underlying core event here, is unbelievably noisy. Like when you go in and open up your mailbox, that single event of just opening up your mailbox triggers dozens and dozens of these events. So you got to sort through things, very quickly, and you can't just throw all of them out there as an individual event right into the logs. It doesn't make sense to do that. So there are some challenges here into developing a signature for this, but we will. I think what it highlights for me is the importance of really what Respond does and what we used to do by ourselves, like before Respond was around in our first version of the product. We made decisions, SaaS Alerts made the decision for, okay, what looks like an IOC, and we'll report on that, right? We were an automated SOC, automated employee that's sitting there studying the logs and then surfacing stuff that we thought you should see. Now our partners have the ability to do that on their own with creating their own Respond rules. And the underpinning of all of this is the science of user behavior analysis. And in the end, that's what caught this attack, right? Individual threat hunters noticing that an account, which is a proxy for a user, was behaving oddly. Like there's some things going on here that you wouldn't normally see. So it's still incumbent upon all of us to rely on our instincts as threat hunters and as security experts to develop those rules and Respond in SaaS Alert's case, to develop the core underlying surfacing of individual events that can be of interest. Because really our mission is, when is there, what indicates oddball behavior from an account? Like that's really what it's all about. It's still that core analysis. And even in this attack, even with expert threat hunters in the federal government and Microsoft looking at it, they didn't prevent this from happening. They noticed that it did happen and stepped in to remediate it. And that's almost always the case. Like, account takeovers, business email compromises, those are all things that we discover post-breach, forensically. It's not like any of these tools are a firewall that magically stops someone. Like if Microsoft or Google doesn't do the job on the IAM side of preventing that account compromise, now you're at a next level, and it's that behavior pattern of the account that lets you know what's going on. And I think that falls right into what Beau has been sharing with with the team in terms of how do we respond and how do we understand these things. So
and
that's a big takeaway for me.
Yeah, and Andrew, that's where the automation I'm talking about comes in. Like, Chip can tell you, he was on a call, I don't know if it was yesterday, the day before, earlier this week, with a brand new SaaS Alerts prospect. And they had gone through the trial and they had a fair amount of data that we were reviewing. And they were like, oh, well, that the information was right there in front of them from SaaS Alerts. They hadn't put Respond in action yet. It was all there, but they didn't notice a really key feature, or I should say a really key information item, which was that this individual that they thought was doing normal behavior was doing it in Pakistan at 3:00 in the morning. So
they noticed that it was, an unapproved location. And Jim, thank you for covering that by saying Pakistan, because I know that's not where it was.
I know,
but it was another one of our favorite bad actor countries. And they did the right thing. They contacted the user, and the user said, oh yeah, I work with these files all the time. And then they kind of wrote it off. And I'm looking at the data and I said, guys, do you see the time on that? Like, what time zone is this person in? Well, they're US Central. Okay. These files were all downloaded and accessed at 3:10 a.m. US Eastern Standard Time. Like, do you really think that this user was working on them then from that country? Because they were convincing themselves, this is a cognitive dissonance moment. They were convincing themselves that something about the system must have reported incorrectly. And they even went so far as to check the IP addresses and validate that the information we had for geolocation was correct. They said, yeah, we looked at these sources and it's correct. They said, but we talked to the user and she says she uses this stuff all the time. Yeah, look at the time. And they were like, oh my God, we didn't even think to look at the time.
Yeah.
Right. So it was right there in front of them, right? It was just one clue that was missed. And they would have, in this case, they, just would have let it go. And that bad actor would still be in there right now.
Right. All right.
That's where the automation comes in. It's why it's so important, because as humans, we can't possibly be able to, gather all this information and dissect it and act on it.
Yeah. Very good stuff, Jim. By the way, I sent you a text. All right. Let's get at 120 here. Beau, let's take it away and
All right.
get on into today, but it's a perfect segue, right, into things that you probably think about, which is, again, emulating what the threat actors are thinking about. And knowing we don't have threat hunters, most MSPs, I'd argue 90, this is a 5.9s. Jim, tag that, man. That we're the 5.9s of threat hunters.
Yeah.
All right, so this is an interesting one, Beau. So set the stage here for us. And again, anybody in terms of just let us know in chat real quick here, Beau, were you not here last week? And if not, I just want maybe Beau to real quick, after setting the stage, Beau, just give a high level of backdoors and breaches, right? We won't go through detail as last time. But was anybody not? So an N for no, you were not here last week. So no, so far no no's.
Yeah.
We had 77 people last week, so we just had people drop off. I know that.
Okay. All right. So go ahead, Beau. We can take it away here.
Awesome. Yeah. So last week we focused on an incident where it's more like a business email compromise type of scenario. This week, it's kind of a similar issue, except we're going to lean a little bit more into the Azure infrastructure on this one. So again, if you were here last week, then I could give a pretty brief background on what backdoors and breaches is, but we can run through it again real quickly just to give a quick reminder. So backdoors and breaches, it's the incident response card game that we developed at Black Hills. And the goal is to solve an incident. And it kind of follows the same Dungeons and Dragons type of pattern where you have an incident master who understands the whole scenario. And that's kind of the role I'm going to be playing. Guess kind of both roles today. But the incident master knows the full attack path. And your job as incident responders is to solve the rest of the attack path by playing procedure cards, which tie to a lot of the standard procedures that you may use already, things like analyzing servers, looking at memory. If you had malware get dropped on a system, maybe you want to look at memory, isolating a device. And through these cards, as you're successful in playing them, which is determined by a dice roll, will determine whether or not the actual attack card gets flipped over or not. So the scenario for this week, I titled it Rogue Admin, but we're gonna throw like a question mark on that because we'll kind of maybe have a little bit of questions around whether or not that's true or not. But the scenario is basically cloud ransomware. All your virtual hard drives and storage buckets have been encrypted. Luckily, you had some backups. But how can we be sure this doesn't happen again? Also, from an incident response perspective, we will dig into it and try to determine what actually happened. So, this would be for your incident responders. What would be the first thing you would do? Like you just found out that all your virtual machines in your cloud network were encrypted. And, like the first things that, would come to my head, it would be like, okay, well, obviously an administrative account of some sort, maybe was compromised, or maybe there was vulnerability that enabled the attacker to exploit one of these systems remotely. So there's a few things to kind of play around with in terms of figuring out that first link in the attack chain. And, in this case, this is totally on your incident response team to kind of, play it to your own organization. But during this specific scenario, first thing we're going to try is user and entity behavior analytics. So it looks like we've been ransomed, but let's start by looking at seeing if any of our admin accounts had any sort of suspicious logins, maybe something strange is going on with those. Traditional ransomware, right? Requires at least some level of administrative account to pivot around the network, pivot around. It's no different in cloud environments, right? In a cloud environment, if you were to compromise, like let's say a global admin or a subscription owner account. That gives you those permissions you would need to actually control all the resources within that account. And so by looking at the user and entity behavior analytics that we have in place, we were able to flip the pivot and escalate card. So our first card for this attack chain is identity and access management policy abuse. So the attackers discover that policies enforced for certain roles and resources allow them to escalate privileges within the cloud account. So, in this case, we basically found that an administrative account was used. We found maybe through UEBA, we saw that this administrative account was logging in from multiple locations. And just like Jim and Chip were mentioning there with the Pakistan logins, right? That's something suspicious and should be something that we should be looking into. And so same exact scenario here. We had a geo IP that is not from our normal office location. So helped us kind of determine it. And this is something that like I said, I kind of wanted to dig into the infrastructure side a little bit more on this one. So this is a super common thing we run into fairly often on offensive engagements. So I would say the majority of our customers tend to leverage Microsoft 365 to some extent, right? But they also end up using infrastructure a lot of times too. So the Azure infrastructure side. Now, one big, I guess really key thing to understand about Azure infrastructure versus Microsoft 365 is there are actually two separate APIs for talking to each piece. So there's the Graph API, which is what is the primary API for talking to Azure AD, and then there's the Service Management API, which is used for talking to infrastructure. And infrastructure is where you would find things like subscriptions. So in Azure, you have subscriptions that allow you to create resources like virtual machines. In this case, our virtual machines got encrypted. So whoever the admin account was in this specific scenario, they must have had some level of admin or ownership over our subscriptions because they were able to access these virtual machines and were able to not only encrypt them, but also storage attached to them as well. So, as an attacker, one of the first things I would do after I get a credential is check one thing. It's do I have access to just the SaaS services, so the Microsoft 365 services, or do I have access to infrastructure as well? Because that is something that becomes really, really important for us as attackers, is to understand, well, do we have the ability to access other resources, things that are, more infrastructure side? And, this is something that, you probably don't really consider that, every user, like in a tenant, in an Azure Active Directory tenant, they cannot do anything interesting in the infrastructure side unless they've been giving explicit permissions. So, the majority of the time, if we phish somebody or if we password spray somebody, we're looking at an account that is mainly just SaaS side, which is, great. It's great and all, there's plenty of other stuff we can look at, email, SharePoint, that kind of stuff. But in the event that we do have access to infrastructure as well, that as an attacker gives us so much more room to kind of work an angle to continue exploitation. So anyways, when it comes to subscriptions, you have the ability to create resource groups under them and then resources underneath each resource group. And the way that permission schemas kind of work in Azure infrastructure is through a number of these built-in roles. You can create custom ones too, but for the majority, people kind of tend to use the built-in roles. And some of those tend to be things like owner, which is one, obviously the highest level control. It's basically like your admin level priv on a subscription or a resource. And then you got contributor under that, which is almost the exact same as the owner, except you can't change permissions. You have reader level permissions too. So if let's say you had an auditor, right, or you had some piece of software that just needed to analyze your resources, a lot of times you just give that reader level permission so it can just access the data it needs to give you back good results. Also, coincidentally, that's what we request when we do pen tests, is just reader level permissions. And then user access administration. So these are some common roles in the Azure world. One thing I want to bring up here is that whenever you create a Microsoft 365 account, there are over 200 service principals that get created by default in your tenant, like day one. And each one of these service principals, they're for things like for like Microsoft Teams, SharePoint. You've got various service principles around like literally every service you can imagine, and each one of these have their own permissions. So each one of these have varying levels of permission. Some of them, basically can just read information. Some of them can change information. Some of them, have full, directory capabilities where they can, add users, modify users, remove users, that kind of thing. And so this becomes a really interesting angle for us as attackers to look for privilege escalation. And that's why I wanted to include it in this section, because, as an administrator of applications, so like the role that's literally called application administrator. One thing that's interesting about application admins is they do not have the ability to create users. They don't have the ability to go and actually modify users. They don't have the ability to do anything interesting on the directory. But what they can do is they can change or add secrets to service principals or applications. And the escalation path here is essentially, if I'm an application admin, I can't do, this user creation capability. However, if I pivot and modify or create a secret for a service principal that does have that permission, which, like I said, there's like over 200 by default in a tenant, that gives me a path to get a little bit of escalation there. And one thing I wanted to pull up here real quick is Azure Hound. So this is for us as attackers, one of the better tools, and also for defenders to run this too, is a great way to see the paths of escalation in your environment. So this is an open source tool. If you've ever seen Bloodhound or heard of Bloodhound, it's a data collection tool which allows you to find paths of escalation in your environment. And the way it works is collects all the data from Azure. So collects all the users, groups, service principals, devices, you name it, like pretty much any piece of data, and then creates a graph effectively showing comparisons and paths from one user to the next one. So like in this scenario I have on the screen here, this is a very, very short path, but effectively we have a service principal in the middle here called Client ID Harvester, which is in the global admins group. And then I have a user over here, Janet Johnson, who is not in the global admins group. She is not a full-on global admin in this tenant. However, she's an application administrator. And by being an application administrator, she has the privilege of adding a secret to this client, to this service principal. And so this creates a privilege escalation opportunity for Janet, because all she has to do is add a secret to the service principal here, and now she becomes global admin in the tenant. And so this is just a very basic scenario showing like literally one hop to global admin. But you can imagine, as you kind of expand further, sometimes this looks like, 5 hops, sometimes it looks like 10 hops, where you have various account compromises due to permission issues within a tenant. So that's the first one. I am access management policy abuse. All right, second link in the attack chain. So what else did this privileged account do? So we know that we found an admin account that somehow encrypted all our stuff. So what's the next thing we should do? Maybe we should look at cloud event logs to see if that specific account did any sort of other interesting actions in that time frame. And this flips our persistence card for the scenario. So we found that the attacker set a second secret for a service principal, just like what I mentioned, right? So we found that they tried to create a level of persistence by establishing a second access key effectively. And so this is something that's kind of interesting around not only service principals, but also in the AWS world, access key creation. A lot of times you can create second set of access keys that effectively are like second passwords for an account. In the Azure portal, it's very straightforward. You literally go to the service principal page, click on certificates and secrets, and click new client secret. And you can leverage that secret with the client ID to authenticate as that service principal. In this case, like this would be a great kind of tie into that Azure Hound screenshot, right? So in that case, the user was escalating to a next level privilege, but this could also be done to persist access, right? Like you could create a secret for another user in the environment and leverage that just as a persistence mechanism alone. Like I said, on the AWS side, so on AWS, you can have each IAM user can have 2 access keys as well. So this is another place where, as from a persistence perspective, you can create a second access key for yourself, or if you have administrative permissions, you can create second access keys for other users too. So in my class, one of the labs I have is we actually create a second access key for another admin user. That way we persist as an admin, right? So in the event that my administrative account is compromised, or blue team detects it, and cuts off access, I have a secondary admin account purely by setting a secondary access key there. All right, so that is the persistence mechanism, secondary access key creation. All right, third link in the attack chain. Yeah, jump in.
But we want to just ask, anybody have questions?
Yes, please ask questions, by the way.
But so far on, as Beau's going through this attack chain, anything?
And also throw out any ideas like how you would respond to certain things, that's the whole game's supposed to be interactive, right? And it's a lot more fun when you have like an incident response team talking out how you would go and solve certain cases, right?
Beau, just curious, you would be looking for, from a social engineering perspective, if you used, OSINT like LinkedIn, like, oh, I'm the Azure admin. I mean, is that stuff maybe again where people need to maybe think twice about what they're putting in their LinkedIn, or hey, I'm the Azure guru at my company? You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yes,
Yeah.
100%. That is something that we have done for a long time now. So pretty much any offensive engagement we do, like not even just red team engagements, but any sort of engagement that involves social engineering or any sort of we need to understand who the admins are, who are the developers. We always do a level of recon up front. So and generally that has helped on a number of levels. So if you went back, we talked about it last week, how phishing's changed, right? And how we spend a lot more time trying to fish for creds as opposed to fishing for C2 or getting a shell on a system these days. But a few years ago, whenever it was not as hard as it is today to get shells, one of the bigger things that we would do is go to LinkedIn and search for the security admins, like try to find who are the engineers of the company. And a lot of times you have guys that are on there, saying, hey, I'm, 5 years experience in blue coat web proxies, and I'm, 3 years in, checkpoint firewalls, and, they give you basically their entire security stack, and that becomes so useful for attackers. Like even just like that little glimpse into, oh, hey, there's a blue coat proxy, like that alone can give you, more info into like how you should route your attacks, how you should set up your domains, how you should set up the payloads. And so yes, exact same thing though, when it comes to the cloud side now, what we end up doing is we spend time trying to identify primarily developers. So developers are the big one. But then also, yes, Azure admins, AWS admins, and in general, developers, because they end up getting keys, right? Like they end up getting access keys in most cases that allow them to deploy resources. And that's what we want, right? Like we want to have either compromise their set of keys or fish them directly so that we get that level of access. We talked about this Monday about how getting access to a cloud account for either Microsoft 365 or AWS or Azure infrastructure has become more important than actually just trying to get on-prem access. And in fact, like even if we do get on-prem, well, oftentimes now we're trying to pivot to the cloud.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating, Beau. And I get, equating this to MSPs, this is where, Beau, they should probably not say, hey, I'm a ConnectWise Automate guru, right? Or I'm a Kaseya BSA guru, meaning the RMM tools.
Yeah, I would say like, in general, any piece of information you give can be leveraged, right? It can be used in a ruse, right? It can, the more information you give out, the more we know about your tech stack, right? And that's really one of the bigger parts of the battle, right? Like if I know exactly what EDR you're using, if I know exactly what web proxies you're using, if I know what kind of firewalls you have, if I know what OSs you're running, I can go build that in the lab and build my payload specifically around what you have, right? Like we have we have all the EDRs in the world, right? In our lab at Black Hills, and we can literally go test out payloads against them. And it becomes like a great tool for attackers, to leverage any information that you're giving them. So
that's in closing. Well, that's where, for example, you could chain, like if someone says, hey, we run this X software, or and there's 2 medium chain vulnerabilities in it. That's where you can start to really do some, testing and say, hey, could we link these together potentially?
Yeah. And I mean, also, when you start to look at very specific pieces of software that are leveraged by administrators, by security engineers. So very, very specific case of one time that we did, we saw that the organization, they had like 7 people, like it was a very small organization. And we knew that their security admins were using Nexpose, the vulnerability scanner, for Metasploit. And so we ended up literally, like, I think I bought, like, it was either rapid7.co or something similar. It's almost identical to rapid7.com.
Wow.
And I completely cloned the website. And then we actually built a binary that literally installed Metasploit, but we backdoored it, and we loaded it up on our own web server, and then fished with basically like, hey, here's your free trial to Nexpose, kind of thing. And so they get the binary, download it, run it, and they think they're installing Nexpose, and it actually installs Nexpose. But in the back end, it's also backdoored to give us C2. So yeah, so like, again, the more information you give, like it absolutely is super helpful for attackers.
And so Ryan asks, what's the best way to get started doing these tabletops, Beau? Should we do a playthrough and then do a lessons learned? Do you create a scenario like, hey, this is around M365? Like, where would you kind of point an MSP like Ryan? And
exactly. Yeah. So I think, create a scenario based off of randomly drawing the cards first. So that's another thing. I don't know if we've really said it, but whenever you start the game, you randomly draw 1 card from each of the piles, right? So your initial compromise, your C2 and pivot, persistence, you draw random cards from them. So you will always have a random scenario. And your incident master will be able to see those and be able to build a narrative around that. And that's kind of where you cater it towards your own organization, right? So your incident master should know what protections you already have in place. They should know kind of, what I guess like the ideal detection and response scenario should be. But then it helps your incident responders think about it and think like, oh, well, all right, so we just literally found out that all our servers are now encrypted. Like, what is the first step that we realistically can do? Like, what capabilities do we actually have? And don't just like make things up like, oh yeah, we're gonna magically like look at this and it's gonna work. You got to cater it to your own organization.
Go and I put in the URL again for Backdoors and Breaches.
Cool.
Out there for everybody. And yeah, I think maybe we could at some point too, but we could even just have a random, like, I don't know, maybe just ask everybody if we could get you back once in the future, like just kind of walk through, like, hey, Ryan, you're going to play Beau and let's go through it just so people could see it. Maybe that like I think that'd be really cool. But Beau, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So absolutely 100%. We could totally do that.
Ryan, would you be up for something like that where you kind of, you're a little bit on the hot seat, but or 2 MSPs where, we make it, Ryan and Ben or whoever.
No, I'm more than happy to participate. I'll get pwned. I know he'll in the sense that like what I think would be helpful for me to build internally is some assistance or guidance around the incident master of how to build scenarios. Like, here's kind of a quick sheet or like a battle card of like, here's our tools and things we already have in place. These are the things that you can kind of leverage to quickly build a scenario based on this random flop.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's been our somewhat challenge to date so far, is like, trying to
Well-
be creative in thinking up what the scenarios quickly to be able to engage the experience in the beginning.
Well, and Beau, correct me if I'm wrong, but if we think just about, again, what MSPs experience in this small to medium business and what the Verizon data breach report, I think, I don't think we have to get too imaginative, Ryan, and I'm asking this to Beau. I mean, just think about
Agreed.
about-
I think like if we start simply, like what
Yeah.
if we abstract it more throughout, because the thing is like we have certain tools and procedures that we have internal to our organization, but every one of our clients' environments is quite different. And so how we respond to each environment is quite different when it comes to the tools and tactics. But if I extract or abstract the guide for an incident master of like, these are the types of categories to focus on, then you can kind of plug in the tools separately to build the
Right.
scenario easier.
Ryan, you just hit on something really cool though, that you could do maybe with your, whatever you call them, your account managers, your VCIOs, whatever, like pick, maybe a more robust company that's, does have an incident response plan that you guys service, right? They spend the most, there are no problem, if you guys say you need
Right.
this.
The most mature involved
Right.
in our
Well,
organization.
right. And here, and you walk through a scenario, but then your team can go, hey, to a next customer and go, hey, we just did this incident situation with a client. We noticed that, they learned this, and this, but they had an incident response plan. So we're going around to our clients to figure out, who, should really think about incident response. And because you're this type of company,
Mm-hmm.
we'd like to talk to you a little more about that and what that means. So.
Yeah, because I see that I can kind of use this almost for like research and development inside our own organization and the team as developing training, but also engaging in a customer experience where we get to share that shared responsibility fabric, which is has been challenging to convey of like, where does our responsibility lie and where does the customer's responsibility lie? And
Yeah.
what I'm envisioning using this for is in two different entirely scenarios like this, and one
Yeah.
is more tied to the customer, is more internal to our
Yeah,
organization.
no, I think they're both good. And I think the more you do it, the obviously internally, because again, they talk about, like having command, the more you guys do it, the more you'll feel comfortable going outward and doing it and monetizing it, right? So
Yeah.
really good points.
Yeah, and exactly like Ryan mentioned, like from an R&D kind of or research perspective, like just drawing a random attack chain and then seeing stuff that you've never seen before or never thought about really gives you that kind of drive to like, oh, well, what if that did happen, and how would we respond to that?
Yeah. It's like our technical account managers would be very hesitant for us to learn that in front of a customer, for example.
Right.
Like, but sometimes that's necessary to illuminate, hey, the response plan and the things that we've engaged in on where we're responsible. If we played through that scenario, we may need to articulate on that there is a gap in that response plan for X and X reason, or, we may illuminate some of the workflows that are happening inside our customer's environment that we don't have indicators for. Like, we didn't know that they were using these tools in these ways, and allows us to have a conversation of like, what is the correct behavior that we're trying to analyze and look for.
Absolutely. All right, cool. I'm gonna continue on. We've got about 10 minutes left here, 12-ish. So let's solve this attack chain. All right, so third link in the attack chain here. We still don't know how the attacker got in or if they set up any C2 or exfil. So let's take a look at them. The attacker, we do know they set up persistence, right? Or they added that secret key to another service principal. So let's take a look at the SIM, see if the SIM shows anything interesting tied to our admin user. And this is going to flip our C2 and exfil card. Create inbox rule to forward emails. I'm sure none of you guys have seen this one come up in your customer environments before. But the attackers create an inbox rule to automatically forward emails to an external address, right? That's one of those things that you hear about pretty often these days. And in looking into our SIM, we saw that this was set up for multiple users. And now you got to start questioning. All right, so we started out with ransomware, right? But now we're seeing that user emails are being forwarded as well. So I don't know how much you guys like see or consider like some of these bigger attacks, and then like the smoke screen that goes along with it. But that's like one of the big things that comes along with a lot of like ransomware attacks, right? Is it a smoke screen for the stealing of and accessing other sensitive data too, right? You know, that's one thing that I always think about anytime I hear about like you know, X hospital or X law firm or whatever got ransomwared. I always think like, all right, well, that's, you know, obviously like their play to you know, look like they're just trying to make money or whatever. But underlying, did they actually steal a bunch of data, and are they selling it on the dark web too? Or are they, you know, backdooring accounts like in this case, and creating these email rules so that they have access to data as well? Because, you know, if your team is scrambling to, you know, go find out how ransomware got installed, are you looking for other stuff too? Or is this kind of stuff, you know, maybe going to go into the radar?
But Beau, that and to your, I think what you're highlighting here too is the challenge and the need for good logging.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So in this case, you know, we had a standard mail rule created, you know, typical, just, you know, forward all emails to external account. One thing I wanted to pull up here, though, is there are other ways to access email too. And, you know, one of them is through OAuth applications. So this is something that is much harder to fish with these days. But basically, so a few years ago, this was a really big problem where effectively attackers were creating these applications within Azure, getting users to consent to permissions within their own account, and then accessing things like mail. And you know, basically like the gist of an OAuth application, an Azure OAuth application, is very similar to you know, if you've ever installed a mobile app on your phone and it says, hey, this application needs permission to read your messages, needs permission to your email or your location, right? And then you click allow, and then now that application has that capability on your phone, right? So Azure has the same thing where you can create these applications that have permissions like mail.read, which is a permission that allows the reading of email from your account. And this was something that we were fishing with for a while. And it looks similar to this, where basically we'd send a link to you, and instead of you needing to, you know, put in a password, or instead of you, you know, downloading a file and then running a file, all it does is it says, hey, permissions are requested. And as soon as you click accept, now your account has accepted these permissions on that application, and you've given effectively that application the ability to do things on your account. Now, like I said, from a phishing perspective, there's still a few very, very small things we can fish with an unverified application externally. And it's things like user.readbasic.all is like one of the main ones. So that permission literally just means that my application can read from your directory. But there's a couple other scenarios where you can create applications that are a little bit more interesting, where you can do things like read email. And that requires either a verified application or within the same tenant. So creating a cross-tenant application where, you know, I'm an external attacker, I create an application in my tenant, try to phish you in your tenant. There's not very many permissions you can actually accept anymore. That's a good thing because that's what attackers were phishing with. But yeah, effectively, like this is another potential method to maintain that access to email as well, though. So we've got 3 of our 4 cards identified. We've got IAM policy management abuse, and then we've got create an inbox rule to forward emails, and then we've also got the secondary access key creation. So far, we kind of know that some administrative account was used to encrypt our virtual machines and storage, but they also tried to create persistence and create a secondary access key, and they also created a rule to forward emails from certain accounts. So that kind of creates this interesting mystery around, well, was it a rogue admin that was he trying to do something malicious, or was his credential compromised? And this kind of pulls us back to, well, how are they initially compromised, right? Or how were we initially compromised?
Oh,
and so yep.
Quick question. Ben says, hey, would best practice be to disable permissions for users to load applications in Azure?
Yeah, so you can, so there's a setting to prevent users from consenting to external applications. And you can also set it to only allow administrators to consent for applications when they're within your tenant. Now, yes, it's great to just disable it overall. However, I will say that there are certain times where there's applications you want to use, right? Like, and that's, you know, things like let's say you had, I don't know, like an email scanning service, right? That, you know, was something that wanted to check your email for, you know, malware or whatever, right? Spam filter, something like that. You know, that might be an external application that you need to actually enable in your tenants to, you know, to allow it to read email. That being said, though, you know, most users shouldn't be consenting to external applications on their own. And in most cases, especially working with small, medium businesses, right? You guys, you know, probably have like a super small number of users who actually need to like install a third-party application like that. And so I would say, you know, it's probably safe to say that you could disable that feature for them to actually accept it themselves and opt for you guys accepting it on top of it. And just you can do like a, I actually saw there was a, you know, there's like permissions request forms you can do, you know, effectively around it, right? Where you know, you can request, you know, an application within your tenant and it just gets sent to your admin, and then they can review it and then determine whether or not to enable it or not. All right, final link in the attack chain. So we still don't know how the attackers got initial access. Let's dig into some permissions, right? So let's look at, you know, some permissions audit around our cloud resources, and maybe we see there's a hole somewhere that we missed. And this is going to flip our initial compromise. After doing a thorough permissions audit against our cloud resources, we discovered a publicly exposed storage bucket. Okay, and in that bucket, we found a clear text cred for our administrative user. Now, this could be, you know, just their straight up cred, maybe on a piece of code, or it could be, you know, like back to like the service principal idea. That's more common. What we end up finding in a lot of cases is that, you know, a developer or administrator of some level created a piece of code, included their service principal credential in the code as like a proof of concept, and then accidentally, you know, uploaded it to like a public storage bucket or even like a public storage repo like GitHub. But in this case, you know, we found initial access was through a public storage bucket that was exposed. And, you know, this is the thing that you hear about, I would say, like in the news more than anything when it comes to, you know, cloud-based resource exploitation, is this concept around public storage like S3, like Azure Blob Storage, getting exposed publicly where literally anybody can access on the internet. Now, finding those as an attacker is not all that difficult in most cases because of predictable naming schemes around the domains tied to resources for storage. And, you know, in the cloud world, almost every resource gets some sort of predictable domain. And what I mean by that is, in the case for storage, let's look at the AWS link here at the bottom. You have bucketname.s3.amazonaws.com. Now that bucket name is something that you as an organization create, and it has to be unique. So anytime you create a storage bucket in AWS, it gets a unique bucket name. It's the exact same thing on Azure. Whenever you create what's called a storage account in Azure, you give it a name. And oftentimes, what ends up happening is organizations create that storage bucket with their company name or their product name, right? Like some product that they're launching. And what ends up happening is when you create that storage bucket, you get a subdomain of, you know, whatever you set it to be. Again, it has to be unique, .blob.core.windows.net. And so us as attackers, what we have to do, and this is something that, you know, anytime we're doing recon for an organization, we run scanning tools to try to identify ones where the access policy is set to container. And so there's a few different access policies around Azure storage. One is private, where, you know, there's no anonymous access, not, you know, nobody on the internet can access it. Blob is almost the exact same as, you know, if you've ever shared a file in like OneDrive or G Drive, and you get that unique URL where you can visit that file with the unique URL, but you can't visit files above it, right, in the folder. That would be the same thing as blob access policy. So meaning like direct file access is okay. But container level access policy means literally if you have the URL for the folder, you can access any file within it. And so the way we go about finding those, there's a number of tools out there to do this, but one of my favorites is this tool called Cloudinum. It's public, you know, open source tool on GitHub. Got the URL there for you. is basically what it does is subdomain brute forcing on the cloud service URLs for identification of things like Azure storage, Azure blobs, databases, virtual machines. All of these services get these predictable subdomains. And in the event that one of the storage buckets was public or open to the internet, this is the way you would find it. And, all it would take is just, going through that data then. Yep. Go ahead, Andrew.
So just because we're at the top of the hour here, Beau, and I don't know who has to jump to another call, do you feel we could, wrap up where we are right now and then come back and close this out next week?
Oh, this is it. We're done. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. No worries at all. So I know Chip just had to jump and some others, but that was fantastic, Beau. Just so some people have some insight, what are we looking at in week 3?
Oh yeah. So week 3. So next week, we're going to start with this theme of data published to the dark web. And our scenario is going to be around our, we were informed that some of our customer data got uploaded to a popular dark website and it's being sold to the highest bidder.
Okay. They're very plausible these days, right? With initial access brokers. So excellent stuff. So I want to thank everybody for joining again. Michelle, any closing comments? I know Chip's out and Jim's out, but
yeah,
anything
they're out. Nope, the hats did come during the call, like I said they would. So if you want to leave a review and get one of these, that would be amazing. They're pretty cool, actually. They're really nice. Good for the beat.
Oh, can you stop? I don't know why I can't see.
Yeah, here, let me stop.
Oh, you can't.
Just see participant.
Do that.
There we go.
3 boxes of them, and I don't have enough room for them. So please help me get rid of them.
All right, they look great.
They're embroidered. Yeah. So just leave a review, and we will get you a hat.
All right.
All right.
Everybody have a fantastic week. If you want to learn more about this Microsoft compromise, we'll see you Monday on the cyber call and then back here Thursday. So make it a great day, everyone. Take care.
Bye.